All right. Well, welcome everybody to this session for data project fails and how to avoid them. Today's presentation will be recorded and you will receive a recording in a follow-up email. So first, we'd like to introduce ourselves, your panel for today. I am Amanda. I'm a certified Scrum Master and Agile Coach. We're currently working on Catapult's data and AI team. Have worked most of my career in both data and application development for manufacturing, insurance, and B2B credit industries.
Hello, folks. I'm Edgar. I am part of the data AI team here at Catapult. I work primarily with data engineering types of projects as well as cognitive services types of projects. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And I'm Andrew Kramer. I'm also part of the data and AI team. I'm a data scientist here, and I've got a lot of experience building models in different industries, from healthcare to automotive. If it touches data, I've probably done something with it. Right.
All right, so what can we expect from today's presentation? It'll be about 45 minutes. We're going to start with some common project pitfalls, then move on to working with data as a team, and wrap it up with some real-world Azure examples. We will be taking questions. As questions arise, please put them in the chat, and we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So today I'd like to talk about some common pitfalls from a project perspective. There's many times we start a project and we've heard some buzzwords. We're excited about technology. We're ready to forge ahead, a lot of energy with the goal of implementing that new technology. And we're asked, well, what is our goal? And we say, my goal is to use data to drive business decisions. Or I've heard about this machine learning. I want my machine to learn. But the most successful projects start with clear outcomes and impacts that we'd like to achieve. We must ask, what's the problem we're trying to solve, or what's the impact we want to have or achieve? So for example, we might have, as a customer retention department, I'd like to predict customer dissatisfaction so that I can retain 20% more customers. So look for the value you're trying to achieve, the impact you want, the problem you want to solve. Work on a hypothesis, test your hypothesis, and adapt. Next slide. So then another common pitfall is failing to identify your intended audience and gathering all the necessary people to deliver from the onset of the conversation. So we often start and work with the small inner groups. We might think, oh, it's too costly to bring in our IT technology team yet. There's so much we need to analyze and get together, but there is immense value in being part of the whole journey and the whole conversation. So as an example, we might get started with some clear objectives and get our working group to tackle a problem such as a cost containment department at an insurance company, I'd like to have more industry normative data around claim costs and discount amounts for competitive analysis and network penetration performance. But it turns out one of our main driving outcomes is actually to be able to respond to regulatory requests. That nuance in audience can mean the difference in success and failure. So while the solution had worked for our operational department's needs, when it came time to use that same data to respond to regulatory agencies, it was failure. We found that the agencies themselves generally require very specific formatting and delivery requirements, and sometimes define things differently than how we would operationally define them. So it's very important to know the voice of your customer, know your audience, and there may be more than one. The business case and personas can be a great way to break down delivery into valuable increments. But remember to stay close to the voice of your customer. Which leads us to our third and final pitfall. Another common pitfall is failure to launch early enough. We're like, wait, we're not ready. We get nervous. We want it to be perfect. If you love your first iteration, you probably waited too long. There will be so many learnings along the way, especially with data. So many of the requirements are emerging requirements. So if you've defined your business outcome that you're looking to achieve and you know your intended customers, ask yourself, what's the next smallest step we can make towards achieving that value? And then work on it and deliver it and talk to your audience and get that feedback. We have to shift our habits to seeing something not as a failure, but as an opportunity to learn and grow. We'll kind of fail forward towards a success. So when we're breaking things down, there's a common tendency to look at breaking things down horizontally instead of a vertical increment of value. We might be like, let's build out our full data warehouse, but it's like building a whole drum line for a song without having the lyrics or the bass or lead guitar. It's inevitable that there's going to be some rework. So it's important to find that business equivalent of your verse or chorus. And why is this important? The beginning of the project is the point where you know the least. Defer decision making to be just in time, especially with data projects. So much will emerge, and small increments of value mean less rework and refactoring. At this point, I'd like to hand it off to my friend and colleague, Andrew, who will delve into a critical component to having our teams in lockstep along this journey.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. So I'm going to be discussing working with the full data team. And before I go to the next slide, I want to describe what that means exactly. We have many different people coming from a lot of different angles. So a data team to you might just mean the data engineers, but to me it means the data engineers, the data scientists, the stakeholders, your customers, your data translators, many different people. So you want to make sure to get everybody in the room as quickly as possible and be able to start communicating. But that doesn't always happen, unfortunately. A lot of the time, people think of a data project in very simplistic terms. For instance, I put this little graphic here together. A lot of people think that data projects are linear, and they go from defining the problem, and maybe that's something done by a business analyst, and maybe they do some data exploration, and then they hand that off to the data engineer saying, okay, we understand the data and we need you to do this task. Data engineer takes those tasks and boom, data engineering. All of a sudden there's a data warehouse. And from here, the business analyst can then do a little bit more data analysis and do some visualization, perhaps, maybe with Power BI. When they've figured out the next problem or something like that, then they go to the data scientist. Data scientist uses some of those insights, builds a perfect functioning model, which then goes into production or is deployed by a machine learning engineer. This is how many people describe data projects, but it's often a little short-sighted. And a lot of people assume that things just will work out this way and you'll end up with a happy customer. What a real data project timeline usually looks something more like this, where you're going from problem definition to data exploration, but then all of a sudden you find that the data doesn't support your use case like you thought it would. Or maybe uh, Greg from accounting is the only one who knew where the data dictionary was, and he won the lottery last year. So you have to, either find it or, you know, call Greg or just build a new one. Maybe you got to the data analysis section, but then realized that data engineering had to add something. Or maybe your model is just not good and you have to start all over. This happens all the time. You can have new stakeholders. The solution doesn't happen. There are an unbelievable number of things that can go wrong that can lead to a failed project or an unhappy customer. So the real benefit, I think, is rather than thinking of a project that has something that is going to be doomed to fail, kind of like how Amanda outlined, it's to think of data projects in an entirely different way, not as a linear process, but rather a circular one that is full of iteration and one that is really brings in communication from the full data team as much as possible. So like I described earlier, uh, the full team is, in my mind, the stakeholder, project managers, business analysts, data translators, which are kind of your data experts. Maybe they're not as technical, but they can show people where different things are. Your data engineer, your data scientist, and your machine learning engineer. You want to bring these people together as much as possible. And like this image shows, and this is from one of my favorite technical books. It's actually not that technical, but it's The Art of Data Science, and where everything is circular. You start with the question, maybe you have to iterate on that a couple of times. you do some exploratory data analysis, you build a model, interpret, and communicate and get feedback, and then start the whole process over again, going back and forward as necessary. Because data projects are cyclical. And this is important to remember because if we assume that things are going to be working rigidly in line, we're going to have people disappointed. So by being the full team, arming the whole team with the knowledge that pe- the whole team is going to need to be involved at different times, we can save a lot of time. Another benefit of being able to communicate in this way is that you keep everybody informed. Maybe the business analyst has insights that the machine learning engineer would never and perhaps should never really know as part of their day to day. But if you can get them on the same call, you can reduce that communication friction and solve problems before they're actually problems. Furthermore, by making sure to include your stakeholder, you can make sure that people are giving feedback frequently. Uh, Something that I have never been accused of doing, but some data scientists are, maybe I have been accused of this, is getting really excited about the problem in a technical way, but maybe losing the true goal of the customer or the stakeholder. And by getting that frequent feedback, then you can make sure that you are actually solving the problem at hand rather than learning about neural nets or something like that. And finally, we all look at data in different ways. So communicating across these different areas will allow force people to look at the data in different ways. Maybe as a data scientist, I'm likely to usually look at the high level performance metrics of my model, but maybe some of the stakeholders want examples of, you know, what what sort of recommendation would this model give me because I have information in there. And looking at the data in different ways from a more holistic perspective is going to help out in a long way. Also keeping in mind this circular process. Second thing that is extraordinarily helpful when working with the team is making sure that everybody knows the data. I mentioned this earlier. Make a data dictionary. Find the data dictionary, use the data dictionary. I will admit that making a data dictionary is one of my least favorite parts of a project. But my actual least favorite part of the project is having to find it or realize or being halfway through a project and realizing that my data dictionary is completely out of date or it just does not exist. This is going to slow you down so much. Find a way to keep everybody on the same page with the data dictionary. Secondly, know your distributions. Know the flaws of your data. Know, over here we have two different histograms. Know that this kind of follows a normal distribution. We see a dip here. Is there a reason why there is a dip here? Maybe there's many missing values. Understanding the data is going to help you sidestep a lot of headaches down the road. And I've got two more different points here, and these are a little bit more specific to data science problems, but I think that they're important for everybody, business or otherwise, to know. Uh, if you're trying to solve a problem with imbalanced data, that impacts a lot of your different decisions. Like, how are you validating your model? For instance, if you're trying to detect spam emails, uh, and spam emails come in 1% of the time, and 99% of the time they're fine, you might make a model that says nothing is spam, and it would be 99% accurate. But uh, not filtering out any spam doesn't actually help you at all, and that doesn't solve your problem. And imbalanced data impacts a lot of other things as well, but uh, let's not go too deep into that right now. The second thing is data leakage, and this is something that data scientist also has to worry about, but more often the business users are the people who really know the process and can help the data scientist avoid it. Data leakage is, when you're a data scientist, you're trying to make a predictive model often of something. So say that we're trying to predict sales of some large e-commerce company named after a large river, like Nile.com. Say that the people of Nile.com are want to predict if people are going to buy a camera. Well, if you include the final purchase of a camera in your model, it's going to be cheating. It's going to be able to peek ahead when in the real world we wouldn't have the information that they had bought a camera. These sort of things, that's a very obvious example, but these sort of things happen all of the time, especially with these complex processes. Final thing to keep in mind and making sure that you have the full team involved is productionization. Uh, First off, Amanda was absolutely right. Don't be afraid to put things into production and see how it works and see how it lives and breathes in the wild. But also make sure that you demo your results before you deploy. A lot of the time, especially with machine learning projects, the data can shift substantially, and you don't want to uh, cement anything too early. So while you want to put it out there, you want to make sure that your processes are flexible enough as possible. And by demoing, you can make sure that you get all that feedback at appropriate times. Secondly, you want to be able to make sure that you can always recreate the results of either your analyses or your models. Doing this is going to help you track down problems with your model, or it can also help you build confidence from your customers when the model is able to output something similar given the right circumstances. Also, build your models as part of a full data pipeline. You don't have to run your full data pipeline every time that you run a model, but making sure that the data is connected to the model is going to help you reduce the issues further down the line. Finally, the last two parts are about keeping an eye on your data over time. So look at how your models perform over time. Maybe the model that you built in 2016 that was really effective then, well, maybe a pandemic happened and all of a sudden your performance has gone down. Make sure that you know that before uh, uh, make sure that you're able to learn that before all of your customers discover that and start complaining, so you can be more proactive in improving your model. And one thing that can impact your performance of the model is data drift. And I've got a little example of my Nile.com sales over here. We've got business clothes, t-shirts, and sweatpants. And let's say a massive pandemic happened in March, and your behavior shifted significantly. Well, perhaps the model that was trained earlier, that business clothes were very high selling and sweatpants were very low selling, maybe that model doesn't work anymore. If you can catch that early, then you can make adjustments to your model in a more effective way. Uh, by communicating, by keeping everybody on the same page, and by keeping your eye on the ball when it comes to your data and productionization, you're going to be able to avoid a lot of issues. Um, and with that, I'm going to now hand it over to Edgar, our resident data engineer who knows all sorts about different Azure products, and he can go into some specific technical uh, roadblocks that you can run into on a data project.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So I'm going to essentially combine a lot of the communication collaborative topics that Andrew was talking about, along with a lot of the topics that Amanda was talking about, and attempt to roll them all together and just give some real world examples of how does this apply to a project leveraging Azure for my business needs. And so instead of focusing on one specific area within the Azure ecosystem, I'm going to just highlight a few of the very common implementations that we have worked through in the past and just essentially showcase how these principles and concepts that we've been talking about apply when you're doing any type of Azure implementation for your existing environment, or essentially bringing up a brand new cloud migration environment. So here are some of the things we'll be diving into today. I'll be talking a little bit about cognitive services, what they are, examples of them, and some things that to watch out for to avoid any project failures. And then pivot a little bit and talk about this newer release from Microsoft that's called Purview, which is essentially our next generation data catalog within Azure. And then lastly, I will hit on some high-level principles regarding data lakes and gotchas for data lakes to assure your project is moving in the right direction. Next slide. So what is a cognitive service? It's essentially low-code package models. It's out of the box, available to clients. And what that means is you don't need to have a PhD, a strong background in statistics or mathematics. Microsoft has already prepackaged all these models, made them available to you. So you essentially are tasked with focusing more on your business needs, your requirements, the objectives, and then configuring those business requirements within the Azure environment, and then the actual model, maintaining of it, enhancing it, the usual tasks associated with those types of project works are all handled through Microsoft under the covers for you. So it's very much a low code solutioning process. Next slide. So we'll talk about a pretty simple, common vanilla use case, which is the concept of the bot. And so a lot of bots get started with this FAQ, frequently asked questions, where you don't want to have your organization get pinged every day by various employees over questions that are pretty repetitive or can be answered by essentially going to a repository. A lot of times what happens is a lot of these organizations have so many different repositories, different systems, and to find a way to search through all that and integrate, and then the different search engines internally versus externally, et cetera, it can get complicated. So within this Microsoft ecosystem here, leveraging Q&A Maker, you essentially upload the relevant content to it, and then that becomes your Q&A. Easy to use, easy to bring up, but a lot of the challenges lie around how to properly not only ingest into it, but also how to properly take advantage of its simplicity. So a couple of things to watch out for is the actual content that you want to leverage for your FAQ. So here's an example. How do I get access to application ABC? So that's the type of question that's a good candidate for an FAQ bot. Now, a question that would change very often, where the answer is pretty dynamic and it may change maybe hourly or dailies. That's where things get a little bit fuzzy, and it may not be a good fit for Q&A. For frequently volatile content that changes very often, that may be something where you probably want to consider a different approach. And then keep in mind, if you have very large content repositories that you want to leverage for an FAQ, a lot of this content may be noise and irrelevant for the types of things that you want to accommodate for your users. So just take time to find maybe a subset of that content and just isolate it in pieces that are most relevant, so you can get very high quality and very relevant answers for the users here. In addition, the actual Q&A Maker does allow you to have metadata. And so a good example of this would be, I have a sales organization with lots of sales content. I have a marketing organization with lots of marketing content. Well, what this allows me to do is I can do some metadata associations within Q&A and say, well, this is sales content, this is marketing content. So now I've essentially tagged them both differently, and I avoid a situation where I'm handing off marketing answers to my sales users and vice versa, et cetera. So you can do that decoupling and have very organized content responses by essentially tagging them within Q&A. Other thing to watch out for is, out of the box, you do get response scores, and that's if you're shooting for high level of relevancy and accuracy there. Go ahead and leverage those out of the box. And then lastly, want to touch on the actual maintaining of it. So once you're up and running, your bot's good to go, you do need to have discussions with the organization in terms of, do we want to automate the new and updated content into Q&A? Do we want to have more of a human manual so that there's proper reviews and things like that? So just keep in mind, once you're up and running, the next thing you want to look at is long-term, how do you want to make sure your content is getting updated and staying relevant? Next slide. Lewis is another cognitive services available, and a common use case, back to the bot example, is how many records were loaded into my orders table yesterday in the data warehouse. Well, that's a common user question that you can look into, trying to avoid having to go straight to your users, your engineers, et cetera, and then essentially having them self-service themselves. So a couple of things to watch out for is, setting up Lewis, it does ask for a data model similar to a database data model. It is asking, how do you want to organize your entities? So just by looking at that question there, I can see, well, I'm going to ask about an orders table. I'm going to ask about a data warehouse, and I'm going to ask about a specific date range, in this case, yeah, yesterday, right? So in this scenario, then, if you start thinking data model, well, I have several repositories. I may have a data lake, enterprise data lake. Underneath it, I may have a enterprise data warehouse. Underneath it, I may have several downstream data serving marts, et cetera. So now you're starting to see a relationship and a data model of this hierarchy parent-child. So those are the kinds of things you do want to have discussions beforehand, and just organizing your entities before you release Lewis to your end users, and just having that dialogue with your business domain experts. Another one is to take advantage of the pre-built attributes available to you. So Microsoft has accounted for a lot of the common ones. In this example, I would leverage the date time one, because I know in my example here, I'm asking about yesterday, and that is a date timestamp from yesterday, which is already available to me as a data type that I can take advantage of, and I don't have to build it or specify it from scratch within Lewis. Domain boundaries. So before you even start the actual project work, figure out, is this a case where I need one holistic Lewis application, or do I need several? So an example is, in this case, my example question is, I'm asking for a status, but I could also do other things like, please submit a expense report. Please submit a vacation request, etc. So those are three different things, and so trying to figure out, okay, this is domain one, use case one, domain two, etc., and identifying those beforehand to figure out how you want to organize Lewis, because the takeaway is it is not a one application can do everything. You just have to have those boundaries organized beforehand. And then lastly, I do want to highlight the automated testing tools that are available within Azure to have a good, proper update cadence, so that when you make changes to it, you don't break stuff that's already there, and just make sure that the existing patterns and language understanding capabilities stay in place as you add new ones in the future. Next slide. Personalizer is another cognitive service available. And this is a case where the bot actually makes suggestions to the user. So in this case, the user was asking about the orders table. So I know at this point, my user is strictly interested in a specific data set. So in that case, then I can take that information and start building up recommendations for that individual user to say, well, we have order headers, we have order lines, we have product data, et cetera. So there are other types of data sets that could be recommended to this user, just based off of the types of patterns we see on the types of questions they're asking, et cetera. So in a nutshell, that's what Personalizer does. A few things to watch out for if you choose to start leveraging Personalizer within your ecosystem. Upfront, it does need metadata. So make sure you've got the proper level of metadata associated with your use cases, because without that metadata, that's where Personalizer will definitely, you'll struggle if you don't have the metadata there. The cold start. The cold start concept, all that is when you're up and running very first time, since it doesn't have that interaction cycle yet with the users, it's essentially fresh. So it will treat every option available equally. So not a huge deal. They're out of the box things available to handle for this. But just keep that in mind. At initial launch, you will have reached that scenario where you're essentially at the status quo concept at a cold start. Other things that are available out of the box is just leveraging the type of historical use cases available to you once you've been up and running, just to measure its effectiveness, and that way you can see any kind of metadata you want to change or add to it, et cetera. So here are two common scenarios. The high school attended by a user may not be relevant, but the department the user works in may be relevant. So what I mean by this is, if I have too much metadata and I'm trying to just jam it all into Personalizer, you may be just creating noise, right? Because my example, my user is asking about orders. The education background of the high school is probably not a good data point to use on what I'm going to recommend. However, if I have the metadata associated to the user, to the department he or she works in, Well, that will let me allow personalizer to say, okay, folks in this department generally ask about these types of data sets, et cetera, et cetera. So now you can, it gets more sophisticated and more better able to provide more quality recommendations for the user. Next slide. All right, anomaly detector and metrics advisor. So just to clear up some terminologies here, there are two separate cognitive services available. Anomaly detector was introduced first, and then more recently, metrics advisor was introduced. They are both different in that the anomaly detector is more API based, and the metrics advisor is also API based, but in addition, it has a lot of bells and whistles, such as charts, UI. You can start to see trends, a lot of very visual capabilities that weren't available in anomaly detector. Under the covers, they're pretty similar. It's one and the same, but they both have their different use cases. One is more for back-end processing type scenarios. The other one is if you want to have like an operations type dashboard. So just keep that in mind in the path you're going to for your projects. So here's an example. Check for the anomalies and the number of records that were loaded into that orders table. So in this case, I know I have a cadence on my orders table. Let's assume it's daily. And I'm expecting this much volume. And so this is a good candidate to see when I receive maybe 10% of my volume, or for whatever reason, 10x. Things like that, so you don't have to have a manual review of your data sets that way. So a few things to watch out for as you start leveraging these cognitive services. One thing is they are time series based. So for the data you want to use it for and the data sets, because it's all organized by data feeds. And so what I mean by that is an orders table volume is an example of a data feed. I may have financial tables. That's an example of a different data feed that may be on a different cadence. So if my orders table is being loaded daily, but my financial tables are ordered quarterly, well, that's an example is where you probably want to separate them into two separate usage patterns within Metrics Advisor. And the reason for that is because it's time series based. So you're applying this daily time series, but your financial is on a different cadence. So they won't necessarily work well together. So just keep that in mind as you're reviewing your different data sets that you want to use in this cognitive service. Assure that you're looking at the actual time series principles themselves to be consistent on those data feed ingestion. Dimensions are key. So for using the anomaly detector, the metrics advisor, you do need your measures, your very typical pattern. In my case, it's order volume. You do need the date, the timestamp itself. Now, that's just for the actual cognitive service to do its job. As a user of it, as a stakeholder of it, the benefit to me is all the different dimensions, the different attributes I can attach to it. So I can start to see a very hierarchy concept within this. For example, in this case, I'm using orders, but I can create a hierarchy of dimension to say, okay, well, associated to a product, right? So I can have product line, sub product lines, et cetera, and then really start to get granular to see, okay, I'm having a lot of anomalies here within my order data, and it's all strictly around this product line or all strictly around this child product line, et cetera. So getting those types of business labels, business terms available to you when you're using these cognitive services, that's when it helps to know that you have the proper dimensioned metadata attached to these data sets. So that's something you do want to do beforehand, before you start using the cognitive service, because it is expecting those dimensions to be specified as you're using the product. And so just to assure that that's all mapped correctly within your data set. And then lastly, the concept of the threshold. So what I mean by this is back to my order, I have my orders examples and then my financials examples. Well, I may have a different tolerance appetite for what I deem is acceptable. For example, if I received double the amount of orders in a certain time period, that may be a tolerance that I know makes sense, as opposed to having like 100x. Now, In my financial data, if I've got double the volume, I probably want to raise that as an anomaly because something could be wrong in terms of what's being loaded into these financial tables. So that's an example where I've got different thresholds. So as a business user of these services, I do want to group that accordingly, so I don't try to mix up these data sets together when I want to treat as different thresholds. That way I can properly react for any kind of anomalies, incidents that are raised by these cognitive services. Next slide. All right, let's talk about Purview. Purview is this next generation data catalog from Microsoft. It is different than the existing data catalog. This is essentially a new independent Azure resource that is essentially data catalog generation 2 and is currently in public preview. Now, I want to highlight a few things that are relevant if you're planning a catalog project within your organization specific to Purview. So first thing here is the concept of the duplicated data. Now, a lot of us, when we hear the term duplication, it sounds wrong. It sounds like we're not doing something right, but that's not necessarily the case here. This is a matter of, do I want the duplication to be exposed in my catalog? So let's do a quick example. I have an enterprise data lake and I have an enterprise data warehouse, very common data analytics implementations. I want to have my Purview catalog scan all my data lake. In addition, I want to have my Purview catalog scanning all my data warehouse. I may have pieces of data in my data warehouse that are in my data lake. Now, if I do a scan on both repositories, well, Purview, when you go into Purview and start searching for data, it's going to say, well, hey, your orders table exists in catalog here in the catalog from your lake, and this orders table exists in your data warehouse. If that's a thing you want and your users are aware of both, they may have different attributes, different schemas, et cetera, different lineage patterns, then fair enough. Go ahead and scan them both. But if this is a case where your organization may see that as, well, hold on, I am double counting, I'm double dipping here because I'm showing it 2 times, then at that point, either filter it out from either or so that you don't scan those tables in both sources. And obviously, this can expand further. It says Purview allows you to scan on-prem resources as well. So just keep that in mind. The concept of the duplication, not a bad thing. It's just something you want to account for behavior if that's something you do want to show in the catalog as your users are searching those assets. Next one is the process, the management of it all. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of the metadata available to you in Purview. Things like glossary terms, business label, sensitivity classifications to find social security numbers, IP addresses. So it's very flexible, and using them, those capabilities is very useful. But you also need to be in a position where you have a good process on how you're going to manage that going forward. So a couple of examples would be, I want to have an automated process so I don't have to have a Purview admin clicking and uploading metadata or editing metadata. So how do you account for that? So do you go API route, some of it, automated versus manual? If you go manual, who does it? So just keep that in mind. A lot of flexibility. Just pick and choose which patterns you want to use manual, automated, for which scenarios in terms of maintaining that Purview, especially as you keep onboarding these new assets that may have different glossary terms associated with them. Lineage is a very powerful feature available in catalog that essentially allows you to see that source to target to get to your last mile ETL. And so keep in mind, although beneficial, if you're doing a lot of deriving of columns, things like that within your pipelines, the lineage may struggle there. So just work through the scenarios that you do definitely want to see that lineage in the catalog, and then assure that they're there. If for whatever reason they're not there because you're doing something very custom in your pipelines, like adding a bunch of derived columns and things like that, you may have to go the API route to have that lineage appear in your Purview UI. And the users for Purview for your organization are the types of folks that will want to look for assets and find out an SME for an asset. Now, the maintaining of it is a little bit different. So just assure you have your persona set up so that I want these set of folks doing my editing, my reviewing of the content, approving changes to the metadata, et cetera, versus these sets of folks doing the actual consuming of that catalog data. So identify those folks beforehand so that you're readily equipped when there's changes needed. Deletes from the catalog out of the box right now are not available. Can be done through the API. To just keep in mind, so quick example is if I'm doing a scan of that data lake, if it's a multi-petabyte data lake, and after I scanned it, I realized I didn't necessarily want it on Purview. You'll have to go through the API route, and so doable, but keep that in mind, and it's not necessarily a quick magic button. Even through the API, you do have to add some logic in there on how you batch up that delete process. So just keep in mind your organization, if you're going to scan certain things and figuring out how you want to handle deletes in terms of how often and which sources may be deleted, et cetera. You may reach a case where you just essentially have more of a dev version of your catalog versus a production version, so you can play around with it, et cetera. Selective filtering, very helpful. A quick example would be the data warehouse example. I don't want to scan every schema in that data warehouse. A lot of data engineering folks create like staging environments, these transient layers for cleaning up data. Purview is powerful in that it allows you to essentially exclude that noise, so you have a very curated catalog for your organization. Next slide. I'll wrap up by going over data lake concepts. Data lakes are now pretty common amongst analytics environments. A couple of gotchas that I would like to raise here. First one is mixing file formats in the same directory, let's say just CSV and JSON. That will cause issues especially for your data serving layer if it's expecting a certain type of format. So just keep those in their own folder, but by file format. Avoid mixing up any of that staging, raw, dirty data with your curated zone. So that way, what you're serving up to your end users or moving to any downstream applications is truly curated, and you don't get this duplicated or corruption of data. So keep those as decoupled as possible in separate folders, et cetera. Directory structures, Azure Data Lake Storage is very flexible in terms of how it handles permissioning. So just keep in mind how you want to organize your reading versus your writes, and who has access to what, and which directories are meant for edits versus reads, etc. And take advantage of the groups within Azure, so that you're not necessarily having to put an individual user from your organization to a specific permission use case. Just let the groups manage themselves and just pop in users in and out of those organization groups within Azure. Lineage information, a little bit lineage than the catalog concept. This is more if you have a lot of ETL jobs that your organization is running. Take time to just put some kind of logging in all those different pipelines so that you capture the timestamp of when things moved into certain areas or certain repositories, especially if you're using a lot of different on-prem, cloud, multi-cloud, et cetera, a lot of different tools. It helps to just have that one central logging mechanism, whether it's flat files or RD or relational database. And make sure you equip yourself with the ability to pause certain things. If maybe during the holidays all your users are out, in that case, you probably don't need your entire pipeline running, so you can pause certain segments of it, et cetera. And then historical loads, a lot of these bigger projects, you may go live and have maybe, I don't know, let's assume a couple gigs a day of data, but the initial launch, maybe your stakeholders are expecting 5 terabytes migration. So keep in mind, whatever you build for your daily pipelines may not be what's needed for your historical. You may actually create 2 loading patterns, whether that's through engineering or business processes, to allow your users to upload, but just keep the 2 in mind, that they don't necessarily apply because they're usually very different sizes in terms of the pipe and the bandwidth needed, et cetera. And then lastly, it happens. We have to reprocess. Sometimes a vendor makes a mistake, has a bug, or for whatever reason, we caught something and we need to override it because the data changed and we want the newer pieces of it, et cetera. So that's a good summary of where we are for data lakes. I'll hand it back to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Edgar. Great information. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Before we do that, thank you for letting us talk to you about our passions. We have a call to action. If you are ready to live a great data story, we offer a data maturity workshop. We'd love to set up some time, get to know you, and get the conversation started. And please take a moment to take our survey. Let us know how we did. This is how we get better and get better at delivering value to you. So please be kind and please enter. Oh, and for every time that you enter or do the surveys after the sessions, you're entered for a $75 Amazon gift card. So, all right, do we have a moderator?
We do. So Edgar, when you were on the slide with the FAQ bot with Q&A Maker, there were a number of questions that came in right around that time. So I don't know if it's specific to that, but just to keep that in mind. Gerard asked, how much structure should be designed into the model for future capability?
So I assume that's a Q&A question. So the structure of it, I usually aim for you could think of it as a 2-column table format. For example, it'll let you upload through Excel. So let's just use that as an example. So in this case, it'd be 2 columns, questions on the first column, and then answers on the other column. So that's the kind of structure. Now, you can have images rendering when you provide the answer to within the bot, but it's a little bit of a syntax dynamic there. And so what I mean by that is if you are wanting to render an image in the response, it's just a markup you have to specify in the syntax such that you can reference this particular image so that as the answer loads, then the image appears underneath it. Another common one is I'd like to have my answer within Q&A also point to a URL. It could be an internal one within the organization or a public website. That same thing as well. You can't just copy paste that in there in the Excel. You do have a little bit of a markup, and then once you put those special tags in there, then it'll render out in your question and in your answer.
Okay. And then Mario asked, how long do you think we should keep our data available? Is there a minimum or maximum time we should consider?
Okay, so if this is specific to Q&A, this really comes down to how often the data is updated. And so this is a tricky one because there is no one size fits all. So let's use preview products as an example. So a catalog purview is in preview right now. So I know that content is going to change very often in the next few months. So that's a good example of if I do put stuff in my Q&A, I probably don't want to just leave it there for many months or many years without reviewing of it. So if I have another piece of content, like, well, where do I get access to this system that's been in the organization for years? That's an example where the content probably doesn't change too often. So the short answer would probably be you can keep it there as long as you want. If the content doesn't change too often, you can have maybe a quarterly, monthly review of it, but you have very dynamic content that changes more frequently than that, then yeah, you could definitely keep it there for years, but it's the review of it that's key to assure any change in company processes or application locations are accounted for if you're doing that manually.
Okay. And then finally on that topic, Christine asked, can the FAQ source from wikis in Teams?
Right. Last was a very common question. So last I checked out of the box, no. So the Q&A, you can point it to a repository and tell it, scan this repository for me, a URL, and get into Q&A. But be careful there, right? Because what that means is, yes, you can scan it if you give it a URL, but it has to be a public accessible URL. Now, most common for us is we have something internal within the organization, some important content that we want in there. And so that's where it gets tricky because that typically has some kind of authentication behind it, et cetera. So that's an example of, okay, so if I have a wiki, what do I do? Right? How do I get that in there? So the first thing is, well, most of the time you don't want all that information from the wiki in there, and then it's picking and choosing which part of it. But yeah, a lot of times what ends up happening is once you, let's assume out of my 10 wiki pages, I want these 5. You can either do an export of it and pump it in there, or look at some kind of API-based approach. The good thing is, though, is since assuming that wiki doesn't change too often, you're pretty much off to the races. It's a one-time exercise, and then you're good to go. If it changes very often, then you probably do want to look at some kind of automation through API in terms of getting it out of the wiki and pushing it into Q&A. So in summary, no automated magic button auto integration available today.
Okay, thank you. And then over to Andrew. You had mentioned the data dictionary and how critical that was to a project. What percentages of businesses, just kind of ballpark, have you engaged with that had a defined data dictionary at the start of the project?
It often depends on the on a number of different factors. I would say that a couple of the startups I've worked with don't always have however, the good ones certainly do have the data dictionary. A couple of the larger Fortune 500 companies I've worked with typically had pretty robust data dictionaries, as their data sets are so large that you have to be able to, and some of the tables are so large, being able to kind of go back and forth. But if you're like a medium or a medium small sized business, I think that it totally depends. And I think that the biggest, rather than size, the biggest factor is the data maturity. And I think that if you are trying to become a more mature, uh, more data mature company, doing a robust data dictionary is often a great place to start.
Okay. And then Amanda, you had sort of inferred about projects often have requirements that evolve as the business sort of climbs the learning curve required for understanding current data technology. And I think, Andrew, you had a slide that sort of demonstrated this feedback loop as well. Is that something that the customer needs to be coached on at the beginning of the engagement to set expectations?
It is great to set those expectations up front. We want to have a growth mindset from the onset, and understand that there are things we just can't know when we get started that we will learn. So the expectation is that we won't have all the answers today, but as we see things and go through the journey, definitely we'll have emerging requirements.
And then on that same theme, is there a way to help the business analyst define the requirements when they engage with the business in a way that translates well to the data engineer? Andrew, you had mentioned the role of the data translator, and I was wondering if that kind of fits in that
Yeah,
translation.
absolutely. And data translator is actually a term that I learned recently from Edgar. And Databricks is one of they do a lot of stuff with Spark and are kind of thought leaders in the area. And they're the ones who define the idea of this data translator as somebody who is able to kind of track down and understands the data while not necessarily being the one who creates the pipelines themselves. But being able to build those levels of communication sometimes requires having somebody in that role. Again, depends on the size of the group that you're working with.
Okay, well, that's all the questions. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.